All right. Hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining this class, this asynchronous class where we discuss architectural sketching. And today's topic, we're going to be talking about drawing with the third point in perspective. So up until now, I've kind of been avoiding this topic because I wanted to get everyone comfortable with 1 and 2 point. 2 point being the most common, I would say, for architects. Looking at three-dimensionality, we can achieve a lot of what we want in a 2 point perspective, where those vertical lines are truly vertical. 3 point perspective can be a little bit controversial, maybe for some architects, especially. We have a tendency of not wanting to show our vertical lines anything other than truly vertical. So, for instance, here, if we're looking at a very tall building, and we have our horizon line, and it's the majority of that tall building is just a little bit beneath our point of view. We have a vertical, the leading edge of that. A lot of architects want to just show the whole building in its true vertical form like this, the world's most beautiful tower. But in actuality, if you went to a building of very even relative height, not even that much, it doesn't have to be 100 stories. It could be 5 or 6 stories. If you're approaching these structures, any structure, and look up at it, which is a lot of what we're doing as we walk through the built environment, we end up having buildings that actually look a little bit more like this, where they taper towards the sky because, as you know, every object is larger the closer it is to us. It appears larger, even though we know those vertical lines are parallel. So in our minds, we autocorrect that and we see a building, even though a photograph might prove to us that it is in fact angled like these lines are. In a true, only 2 point perspective, we have these 2 points at the horizon line, and then these two lines are parallel to one another, so they never meet. They're just totally straight, vertical at all times. Whereas in actuality, we still have those 2 points on the horizon line, but now we also have a point off into the sky because everything is vanishing from us in every direction. In orthogonal buildings, it's more rational to understand these things in just a series of points on horizon lines and into the sky. In reality, this line is never even straight. It's actually more vertical at the base and it arcs. It's all kind of bending into space away from us, kind of like the fisheye view where everything is exaggerated in every direction towards points. It's just that we normally don't have buildings that have all these different faces and vanishing in different ways. So for simplicity's sake, we have 2 point perspective and 3 point. And so today I'm going to take a very simple idea of 3 point perspective, and we're going to take a look at this, which is really a street view. And Google Earth is really masterful at highlighting the intensity of what a 3 point perspective is, because as soon as you start moving that camera vertically or even down any direction other than straight at that horizon line, you get this really severe notion of a third point into the sky. And so, like, every building is heavily leaning. You can see off to the edge here, so much of this is really even more than you would experience if you were standing in this place. The moment you turn your head and look at this, it actually will flatten out because where you are looking, your point of view, the place that is focused on is where the vertical happens. And so in this case, if I'm coming here and looking at this building, my focus is right about here because that is where I'm at the horizon line, but I'm also focused here so that vertical is truly vertical only in this spot. As I look in my peripheral vision, that's when I'm starting to see these lines start to splay out, and they're all still going to that same point in the sky. And this, likewise, if I start looking in my peripheral vision towards the left, same thing happens. I'm still going up to that one point. In reality, though, we have peripheral vision. If we look over here, those become the point that we're focusing on. And this building would start to lean in a little bit more. So in photography, we just have like a larger, wider field of vision. Google Earth has its ways, how it calibrates things and focuses on certain items. And for this image, we're going to focus on the Spertus Museum. This is designed by Krueck Sexton. And I want this to be not only the ideas behind three-point perspective, but also how to make buildings more three-dimensional than they appear. I always try to make, of course, we all try to make our images, the things we draw, look as good as possible. One thing that might be a little bit difficult to see in this image, and the reason that I chose it, is the ideas of three-point perspective are simple here. And we can see that because we could see two sides of some of these adjacent buildings, and certainly more so as you move down the street towards the north. But this building is also all glass curtain wall, and it's faceted. So it's not as simple as taking its neighboring building to the south, which is a flat curtain wall. You can see here, Gensler actually reclad this building about 10, 15 years ago with a frit pattern that's supposed to emulate the building that was demolished to make way for this building, or what it was there previously. So it might be a little bit difficult to make out here, but there is some frit patterning that shows a masonry kind of screen print on top of this curtain wall to kind of emulate whether it's successful or not. It's very, very subtle. You might only realize it in certain light, but anyway, it's a flat curtain wall. And so all of these lines are responding to the vanishing point at the end of Michigan Avenue, which is here. All of the lines on this building are converging, as well as all the floor lines on the neighboring buildings, but it's flat. The Spiritus Museum is faceted, and it might be a little bit difficult to make out, so I can come in here and just trace over some of these facets so that you can see more clearly exactly how many have been created and how this will help us to better understand how this building has been designed and how we can draw it in its best light. I want to make this building appear more three-dimensional than this photo makes it look. And so as I trace each one of these facets, I'm going to treat each one of them differently. I'm going to accentuate the entry condition because it's probably quite difficult to see in the photo that I'm tracing. But this facet actually peels away from another surface behind it, and that calls out the entry condition. So these are the facets. And the interesting thing here is, unlike the Gensler curtain wall, which is flat, every time that we come to a facet, it changes, it bends, it wraps up over and back again. So what is a flat floor line behind, the reason this building is folding, the angles of that, what is a flat and elevation, becomes much more rich in its accentuation on each face of the facet here. And it's even more apparent the higher up you go. So you can see this one, it's angled, it starts to make the move from the upper left to the lower right, just as the Gensler building is kind of keeping us true that angle. So I'll work out how this can be developed. So thinking about this in three-point perspective. So the first thing, always, we look at this image and right away we can identify where our horizon line is very low on the page because we're really looking up, we're focusing on the tower aspect. Even though this building is maybe only 10 to 15 floors, it's important to understand where we are in relation to this. And we're not looking at a super tall building here. If you were looking at a 100-story building, the same principles would be applied to it. So I'm going to come in here and near the bottom of my page, the bottom maybe fifth of the page, draw that very light horizontal line that will eventually disappear because I'm not seeing any horizon line. This is a lot of buildings in the foreground, so there's not going to be any kind of horizon that will be visible at the end. So this is just trying to clean that up a little bit. Okay. And so we know that in this image, it's really up to you whether or not you want to show as much context. Perhaps you want to focus on just the building and maybe its neighbors, immediate neighbors, or expand that all the way. I'm not too concerned with going so far as to show the horizon line and its vanishing point here at the end. The building sometimes, if you start expanding these too much in a three-point perspective, things start to lean so much that they become unrealistic. So this is 1 and 2 Prudential Plaza. They are leaning so much that they seem almost as if they're falling. And so sometimes in a three-point, you want to make this more of a portrait orientation, cropping out some of that kind of crazy geometries that appear as though that you're struggling too much to expand a view too much. So in this case, I would advocate for a portrait orientation. And it's entirely up to you if you want to show, the street, the cars, and some of this streetscape as you look north, but I'm going to probably just not show that vanishing point all the way towards the end of the page on the right. So the base of the building and its neighbors are all going to fall along the same line. And I can see now that my camera isn't really picking up that bottom. There we go. So normally I would start off by indicating the base. That's what I have here. And then just start drawing my vertical lines. I can't draw vertical lines now. If I'm going to be doing a three-point, I have to remember only the middle, like I've mentioned before, the middle of your subject matter is the only place that we now have a truly vertical line. So I'm going to go just off of the center of my page, is right about here, the center. I'm going to show a little bit of context, a little bit more context on the right. So I'm going to draw my vertical line just left of center. Again, just the construction lines, lightly into illustrating this so that I'm not coming back and having to do too much cleanup at the end. And now this building is relatively simple and its front-facing geometry is rectangular. So if you want, like I had mentioned before, looking at these angles is very important to set up that third point. So if we look at this and we want to try to emulate that as best we can to give us an idea of where that third point is, because that is vanishing so far off the top of my page, I'd have to reach to the very far side of my table just to identify it. So without having to actually locate that point in the sky, just as I don't always locate the points on the horizon line, I want to be able to match these angles and then make some educated guesses as to where those are all collapsing. And so here again, we start looking at the geometry proportionately. How many of these base condition lengths would there be in the vertical? To me, it seems like about 2.5. And so you'll want to do the same thing here. So I actually drew this almost the length of my pencil. So if I were to come up, and this is kind of a goofy trick, but you come up twice, 2.5 points times that. And then again, we're now developing this geometry to find out what kind of condition we have at the sky. And that line, if we're just drawing a rectangle right now that's not faceted, this is also going to be telling me as a guide where that is going to collapse into the third point. So now you realize how flat this base really has to be to get all the way off the page to the same point where this is collapsing. So once we have those key elements identified, we can come back, look at the facets. We can either start with the facets and develop this, or we could work on the context. So right away, just to kind of make things a little bit more clear, I can see that this building does not have a flat top. So I can come back here and start to sculpt some of what I see with the facets in mind. This appears to have a taller section on one end, a flat area. I mean, it's flat in elevation, but because I'm in perspective, it's not. It's cutting down. That's this. It looks like there's a small balcony right there. And then it comes back up, and then it looks relatively flat, maybe not quite parallel to its neighbor, because the neighbor is, you can see that if I were to just extend those lines, you can see that I don't really want that one to be quite in the same geometry as the neighbor. It seems to be just a little bit kicking away from us like this angle. These are not parallel lines. And then it looks like there's a small little setback. So that's kind of what I'm going to be looking at for the top condition. And a lot of what we're going to see here in this building is going to be heavily relying on how well we can proportion things. So it's just finding clues and learning from those. Just like I did at the top, I'm going to come down here at the base of the building. At the entry, I can see that there's a curtain wall that's low, and then it rises to a kind of story and a half. And then there's going to be a higher place where the curtain wall stops, an exposed column that looks like it's clad in a uh, kind of chrome or polished metal here, stainless steel perhaps. And there are two columns. So I'm going to come in and just lightly draw both of those. So now I want to find a relationship that I can build off of. And when I drew this at the top, I can see that there's a facet that comes almost straight down. Maybe not quite straight. And remember, when I say straight, I'm thinking about this in a three-point perspective. So all these verticals, really none of them are truly vertical straight on my paper. They're all collapsing towards the sky. But I can make a connection between this point and this point. And that I like to find these relationships because they can help me in the long run organize things that seem complicated. So the bigger moves that I can make early on, I can fill in the smaller things later. Okay, so I know that that's my true vertical. I have this one. This is coming down. It's kind of tying in both of these points that I've established earlier. Now I think about right about here, this is just about midpoint up the building. There's a node where a lot of facets originate from. And I have a little kick here in my geometry too. You can see the changes orientation there. From this point, it looks as if there's a facet that reaches down a little bit, and then it opens out. This rests just above the front entry. Another facet then from that point connects to the point that that balcony or that setback comes out from. So if we're following along, I've drawn this and this. Other things that I can now kind of come back and see with some kind of certainty. This edge, another facet I've developed there. And again, these are all kind of judgment calls. If I were drawing this without doing a tutorial, I would be going much faster without explaining things. So as time goes on, if you draw for a good period of your career, you'll be able to really move with more speed on this as well. But all of the things that I do, because they're not measured, they're all kind of best guesses of proportion and scale. So now I've just quickly drawn a kind of zigzag, which I've developed based on the lines that I see. Other things now, we're seeing another series of facets that come up, and I'm collecting more points that I've established from the beginning. And we also have some trees that are interrupting the geometry here, and I'm just going to just very, very briefly show that. So I don't really have to resolve things where I can't see what's going on anyway. throughout the semester, we've drawn a lot of contemporary buildings, and all of them have their own unique challenges. I'm hoping that by looking at different architects and the way that they do things, you can use some of the things that you've learned here for your own designs, how you might render them, whereas in the past you might not have thought about how do I, I know how to draw punched openings. I might know how to draw standard curtain wall, but there's a richness to understanding different forms and geometries and then how to shade and shadow them so that they can become more aligned with some of the designs that you may be working on. I could see one of the facets that I didn't address initially is here, because I could see everywhere that the horizontality of the curtain wall changes geometry. That's a result of how a facet is interrupting it, a different um, change of plane. Okay, so now I'm gonna come back. I realize that there's gonna be a soffit. I can just barely see it. And actually this curtain wall extends a little bit. So there's a curtain wall here that column runs up to, and then there's a series of struts that laterally support this piece of curtain wall that is peeling away from the rest of the massing beyond, which will be important because this is going to be, I'm going to draw this in shadow a little bit later, and so that I'm going to try to make this look much more three-dimensional with contrast than the photo suggests. It's kind of washed out here. This is a kind of, it doesn't even look like a real sunny day. I mean, there's some blue skies and clouds, but you could see that this face of this building is a little bit more in sun, and the rest of this face of these other buildings are all in shadow. So I'm not seeing this building with a lot of contrast because the majority of this whole face, everything on this side of the street that's facing the street is in shadow. I'm going to try to make it look as though it's not all in shadow. So otherwise, if I rendered this all in shadow, it would look very uh, monotone, gray, kind of dull. All right, so moving back to this image, I've got now the idea of the facets, right? This is the base for the way that I'm going to be laying this out. The last few things that I just want to address before getting into the building, now that I have this, I could just continue to work on this, developing it and trying to illustrate things on its own and then going out into the context. The thing that I want to work on a little bit more before I jump onto that is these neighboring buildings, because they can lend clues for how I want to continue. So the building to the right is probably a pre-war building, maybe 1920s, with a large cornice at the top. It has a probably a limestone few floors that have punched openings and another cornice that relates to this ledge. And remember, every time I come across, I have to continuously move that line so that I'm always going to the same vanishing point in the sky. So sometimes I'll even draw little guides like this. These are all construction lines, but they're all kicking out a little bit more, just a little. And likewise, as I come here and look at this building on the left, this, of course, is all coming down to a vanishing point on the horizon line to the right, but these lines also are just starting to grow as they come to, they're spacing apart a little bit more as they come towards the base of this building. So it's almost like I'm going to set up a grid, a guide, before I go too far. So, and sometimes people can get tripped up on this because, a lot of these vanishing points are off in the distance. So one trick that you can use here, this is the horizon line, the vanishing point is off page. Just look at the relationships here. And if you see that this is the top of a guide that we have and this is the bottom, choose a point right in between, right in the middle. And then come here more towards the middle of the page. And again, you see the bottom of the building, the top. That's what I've defined at the very start, roughly in the middle, and draw another dot. Then connect those two. That will set up a midpoint that you can draw from, and then do the same thing. You take these 2 points, now you're bisecting that lower half. So we're kind of ending up with quarters now, just connecting points. You can keep doing this as many times as you want, breaking all of them in half. So as long as you keep equal sections, you start to see that you create a grid that is now consistent with all of the geometries running down to one vanishing point here. You could even do the same thing towards the sky, except that vanishing point is much further away from us. So I'm just relying on a kind of generalized way of laying that out with these guidelines. All right. So now I come back to my page here in my image and I start looking at those relationships again. And every time I look at a punched opening building, I really do everything I can not to count floors and count windows. That's not, they sometimes demand a lot of us where they try to understand what it is that the relationships of them are. But if we have those guidelines, I can just, again, with really early here construction lines, I can stay true to those things that I've spent time measuring, and I can just start laying them out like this. So that when I come back with more final line work, I can be confident that I've drawn this in a way that is relatively accurate. At least accurate enough that no one's going to look at it and be like, oh, something is terribly wrong. And then I can even come back and add those little guys, just like I've done here vertically, I can do the same thing with the horizontals, just to organize some of those thoughts and always just the big picture ideas of what's happening in a building like this kind of banding effect that creates different levels of hierarchy, like the base, the middle, the top, very common with these types of buildings. And in one of the previous lectures, when we talked about sight, this will come in handy because there's these trees along the sidewalk and between the road that we can use some of the tricks that we learned in a previous lecture. And it can sometimes also bring life to some of these street fronts that look for some foreground context. So as I continue now, as I make more relationships, I can see that there's another building here. This is the Congress Hotel. One of the few faces that we're really seeing on this face. This one, again, is collapsing towards the vanishing point towards the left. We're vanishing here, and then another, this is coming down. Looks like there's actually a smaller blue building in front of it. And then after we get past this mass here, it looks like everything starts to really collapse. So things are really growing closer and closer together. Which is really, you're seeing a lot of that verticality as you go down the street. So the building that's been reclad, it's important not to ignore that because if we're considering the siting of this, which is important because its context is really important that it completes a street frontage. It might not be the most inspiring building, but it is a context nonetheless, and we want to address it. So this is going to just be a series of horizontals and verticals that there's kind of a horizontal banding with shadow box. These are more guides. When I come back in the final conditions, I'll straighten these out and tidy them up a little bit more. There's probably an entry condition here, nothing that I have to spend too much time on. But then one thing to really draw your eye is, again, adding some of that foreground, if it's just simply some joints in the sidewalk. And so the last thing before getting into some of the final line work is managing these. And the real way to accentuate the facets here is trying to, unlike the building to the left, where it's all just horizontal down to the vanishing point, we have those guides. If this building were truly flat, like its neighbor on the left, those slab edges would look like this. But now we're going to have to look at each one of them and consider how that they're behaving. So I would start on the left-hand side, seeing where we are, and then take each one of these. As we're low, the way that they behave is going to be relatively simple and straightforward. That you can see they're jumping up and down a little bit. And as we go up, they're going to start to angle more and more. And I drew these lines as if the flat line is a guide to tell me whether or not I'm veering off course. Because if I don't have any lines or any context here, I'm relying solely on the relationships of what I see and then translating that to my paper. This way, I can right away know if I'm coming up towards the upper right relative to a truly horizontal relationship, or so now they're coming up or down relative to that line. So as I start this, I'm going to just, for simplicity's sake, start off by saying these are relatively flat and equally spaced. They go up and they start sloping a little bit more, and I'm only talking about the face that is closest to the building on the left, and then I'm stopping that line when it gets to the first facet that it runs into. The first one is relatively subtle. As I get to the first facet, I'm going to just kick down ever so slightly. And as I get closer to the bottom, it's hardly even noticeable. So I'm talking about the difference in the angle between this and then it kicks down just a little. So that tells me that this is inset. That facet is inboard of the face of the building on the left. And then once I get to this point, it returns. So it comes up just slightly. And so then some of these are relatively subtle changes in geometry. Others are more severe. So this one, I'm going to kick that down. I'm going to take this one and make it a severe. So this looks like it's kind of running flat. It kicks outboard towards the street and then back. And then it flattens out. So every time you get to a facet, consider what could that be doing and change the geometry of that floor line just a little bit. Even if it's not apparent. Kick that out, see how that. And now here things are going to get a little different because this is the face that is actually outboard. That's why I drew those outriggers there. And I have those lines in the distance and those so I can see that they're where true horizontal would be, and I'm coming out just a little bit different than that. Okay, so now I've got a series of lines. I'm referencing that line in the distance where I don't want to deviate too much from it. So if I started here, or okay, in this case, I have a construction line here. I'm starting just above it. I should be relatively close to it or a little bit above it as I come here because the building on the left and the building on the right are coplanar. That means where I started, I should be roughly close to that on the other side. Otherwise, the floors aren't flat. It means something, I know I'm starting from the same point relative to the building on the end. Otherwise, if this building were full of ramps and different geometries within the building and there were no flat floors, then I'm in a totally different world and nothing makes sense. I wouldn't even try to teach this building, but I know that this building has flat floors. I've been in it. I've had a Christmas party there for a holiday party. That was a nice experience. And that would be the way that is a simple way of understanding that these facets are just moving back and forth in plan, not in elevation. So this is going to be how I think that I can begin to work with more final lines. And so for today, I am going to be using a black colored pencil and ink, which is the media that I like to use much of the time because it can give me that extra contrast and also the precision of the microns that I like to use so often. I can get the precision, and then after I've got the kind of line work set, I can come back and add the tone for the contrast. Okay, so here again, I'm just going to look at that edge and I'm going to take that line all the way up. And focus on the facets first. Facets are going to be, although they're just as subtle as the rest of the curtain wall line work, I'm going to make sure that I get that down first before moving on to the actual curtain wall panels. I don't want to rush this kind of thing, but if you enjoy sketching and you do this kind of thing more often, you can really abbreviate the amount of time that you devote to this construction line business where not, it's kind of a check. It's a safety thing right now that I use for teaching these kind of courses because people can get very, very frustrated if someone just jumps into it and starts explaining things without setting it up, because then people realize even if they're following along, it can be difficult, and then they have to throw it out, hit pause, wait, do it again, and then come back. You could, of course, draw these things in pencil and graphite and keep it that way. I like using ink because there's a very, very uh, the permanence to it, of course, but there's also the fact that that contrast can be greater. And I do often notice, maybe not so often, but I do notice from time to time that what I did in my construction lines is I look at it with more attention, I come back to it, and then I have to make changes. I am not going to draw this lamp post. I actually think that one of the previous lectures I did with Adolf Loos's Tribune Tower competition, there was a lamp post. I actually feel like I shouldn't have drawn it. And I only realized that after the fact. I don't know. There was something about it. It felt like it was foreign to the composition, and I don't, I suppose I overanalyze my own work sometimes. I'm just going to draw this edge, this profile. I think it's actually beneficial to when you're doing a toned drawing, not to spend too much time on something like these, because you're going to lose a lot of that line quality when you come back with tone. And some of these photographs and images that you find, not all the details are clear. You come back and you can create things that are clear. It's hard to kind of fake it when you're drawing things with lines like this, but there are ways to kind of just mull over details and they kind of fade to the background. So I don't really know where the entrance is here. I'm assuming there's a revolver or maybe a swing door here. Not terribly important, but I'm just indicating that something is happening in the base. I can't tell. A lot of reflectivity and it's in shadow, so there's that. Um, One thing that I didn't draw when I did my construction lines are the verticals of each of the panels in the curtain wall. I can come back and do those now. The same thing will apply. The verticals come up, and then when they hit a facet, these will be much more subtle because the difference in each of the verticals from one side to the other, they're just changing very, very slightly, whereas the horizontals are changing much more radically. The angle from the base to the top is much more different than the little bit of a wedge that I've created in the vertical orientation. There is still some of that happening, but it's almost difficult to make out exactly how that's working. So they can be more flat. But so, for instance, this line's coming up, I'm going to kick it out just slightly, hardly even known that that's happening. And then I'm going to come back again up here. So this line is actually kind of waving back and forth wherever it hits a facet. I do want to make sure that I get this. Although when I come back with tone, I might lose some of it, but maybe I have to reinforce that with heavier line work a bit later. But this face, this one that is coming out, I'm going to make sure that I get that highlighted as that part peels away from this face behind it. Just referencing, going back and forth between what we see in the image, and then every time we get to a facet, I'm reallocating the directionality of the vertical, just as I did with the horizontal. I've never drawn, no, I've drawn this building once before. It was with it was on the toned paper. It was more elevational. This one is much more heavy on the perspective aspects of it. So in a way, I'm kind of experimenting with you as I draw this. I really never want to draw the same building in the same way more than once. That's why when I messed up one of the previous tutorials, I didn't want to draw the same building again, so I just went to another one. So one thing to take note of here is that the building is really showing more width between the vertical panels here, and then as you come around further away, you're seeing them in a little bit different. They're collapsing, so you can see this panel looks much, much wider here than these panels do over here, so they're kind of gathering together. Okay, so then I come back here. Now things are getting more serious. I want to make sure that as I come through here, these are relatively, I mean, similar spacing. So if I started just going drawing these lines horizontally to the vanishing point without thinking about how they react to one another, I would see some becoming very, very tightly spaced and others very far apart in the way that they're spaced. I'm trying to make it, there's a kind of rigor to this to try to bring them to a realistic kind of spacing, illustrating that there is floor slabs behind them. And of course, each time I go up, they get a little bit closer together. So with this kind of three-point perspective and a faceted, it is a challenge. I'm aware some of you are probably like, oh, why couldn't he just teach this part with a square box of a building? Well, that's part of the fun. So I have all these lines behind me that these construction lines are telling me something. They're guiding me, but they don't always end up being the place that I want to draw everything. And just remember, every time you draw a line, you have to continue it. You can't just say, "Oh, that was terrible. I'm not going to keep that going." The whole point of this is that there is a continuity between these lines. It's not going to be perfect. It's a sketch. I get that. All right. So there is the Spertus Museum Institute, or whatever you want to call it. I think it's both. I then, after I've got that set, I'm going to come in here and just take my eraser and come across and erase all the evidence of all those construction lines. And I'm going to end up with a building that has a lot of crazy grids on it, but there's a reason and a rationale behind all of them. And depending on how much time I have here, I always try to keep the tutorials to be between an hour, hour and 20 minutes. Let's see, what do we have? About half an hour left. So I'm going to focus on this primary subject matter before moving on to the context, because it's important, I think, to focus on this more than anything else. So I now have one single line type that indicates the basic geometry. I want to come back now and I'm going to use a heavier pen that'll give me some, I don't know what it is. I don't know if each of you are finding this too. I have to end up having so many different pens because every time I draw, it seems like the tip that I love is no longer with me. So you can use a Micron 5, a Micron 8, or I'm using the fine liner, the razor point. They all offer a heavier type of line than my Micron 1. And this is where I really want to accentuate the very top of the building as it meets the sky. I cannot tell for certain if this is a setback. It seems like it is. And I know that I had mentioned in the past how I like to use line weights and line types where there's a profile edge. It can also be used to accentuate certain things that you just want to highlight. So even though this is a change of plane, which is normally the second line type, I want to, and a lot of this will be lost when I bring in another tone. These nodes that come together, I'm just highlighting them a little bit and then I just fade it out. So where these come together, I'm indicating a heavier line. The edge. And partly this is going to be so that when I do come back with a heavier shade and shadow, I can easily identify where those nodes are happening. Because when I have this grid, it's not quite as noticeable. I started off with all these facets, and then when I overlaid the horizontals and the verticals, I lost some of that. So now I've got some of this taken care of with ink and line work, and now I'm going to come back in with my colored pencil and start to look at the facets in a different way. So starting with the base, I can see that the entry condition is recessed. That's clear. And there's also two levels of curtain wall. I want to make sure that I identify the fact that there is going to be a deep recess here. As always, I like to get that soffit dark, even the top of the column. The column is circular in nature. I want to make sure that one side is in shadow more than the other. And there's this recess, this curtain wall entry condition. Yeah. All the curtain wall is going to be reflecting, of course. And so when I cannot see the reflections in the photo that I have, so I'm making them up as I go. This I'm indicating is being darker because that is the shadow that is being, or I should say the reflection that is being cast on the curtain wall. And so you can see that this now becomes a dark recess that really sets this back. And additionally, like I had been saying again and again, I want to make sure that I can highlight the fact that this piece is peeling up off of the curtain wall behind it. And so that's also going to be quite dark. And here it's very thin, it's close, it's because it comes to a point where they meet there. But this one, with as a kind of gradient, I can lift that up off the page so that this looks like I'm also going to say that you make just like when we look at other buildings, the one face is illuminated more than another face. Same thing here. As I look at these faces, I'm going to I have to make a decision. Which ones am I going to highlight and which ones am I going to give a little tone to? So I want this one to be illuminated because if I make this one a bit darker, it will appear as though that it's not as lifted off the page as if I would leave it as a light color. So this is going to be, and I use the edge of your pencil for some of these to get a nice uniform level of contrast and tone. So you just have to keep looking at these things and trying to determine how they're behaving. You know, which one is facing towards a little bit towards the north and which ones are facing a little bit more towards the south. And, you know, I'm not always going to be right on this stuff. In fact, I've seen as you go through it, you might say all these facets, they're not behaving the way I want. I made a mistake, of course. With graphite, it's easy to do, and colored pencil, not quite as easy, but you can lift some of that tone off of here. So I noticed that I actually wanted this one to be darker. Even if two faces look the same, I sometimes build one edge of that up a little bit, even though it's just because When two similar faces come together, we know that they're different, but we need to differentiate them in some way. So I end up just adding a little bit more tone on one edge to kind of emphasize the fact that there is a change happening there. And I also know that maybe because, I look at these glass buildings all the time, it looks like a glass building here, but we also see that there is some reference to what is probably either a frit pattern, a shadow box, spandrel. There's a banding. It's very subtle, but you can make it out. I am just going to show some of that there is still, I'm referencing some idea of a banding. It's very, very subtle, but it's still there. And again, I don't count the floors. I'm not going to pay attention to that kind of detail. This is a sketch, so I'm just going every other floor is being treated with a base of a little bit of a banding in the horizontal orientations. And I always use this trick of whenever I could just do a black and white drawing. I could do that, and maybe I should. I should. I'm trying to get ahead of myself and just adding a little bit of pop to this. The drawing right now is very, very kind of muddy. I mean, I see blue and maybe a little bit of warm yellows. To lift some of this out, sometimes I add a little bit of yellow just to make it look like it's receiving a little bit of light. Uh, I can come back here at this foreground tree. Again, I'm going to have to choose a side. Where do I want that light to come from? And I could just say, all right, this is the bottom of the tree canopy. The underside is going to always be in shadow. I'm going to make that dark as well as the trunk, the base of the planter box. We can just make sure that we add a little bit of tone to this. And then here again, one side, if this we're determining that this side is getting light, one side of the facets is getting more light than another. Without getting into the details of how the light is hitting this, I just want to try to, even in the foreground here, give some impression of shadow of that tree as it casts a shadow on the sidewalk. And the same would go for this one, which I haven't, if we want to, one way we can think about this is getting those crisp lines in ink on one side, just focusing on our subject matter. The other lines can be just using the colored pencil, not using those outlines as we have on our subject matter, because then these other buildings kind of become more background. So I have drawn those construction lines. I can be much more loose with the representation of these context buildings. Not to say that I don't have to continuously maintain a level of quality on my line work. Here again, just using those tick marks. And some of you might be big on classical architecture, and you might be upset, oh, Ryan draws too many of these contemporary buildings. I want to draw these buildings that he's got on the side there. Hopefully you are getting your fill of doing that from the Milwaukee sketchbook. And if not, uh, don't worry, you'll have plenty of opportunity to draw classical buildings on your own time. So here is, the amount of, attention or detail going into this building on the side, not too much. Then coming back, this foreground tree again, just referencing some of the little quick line work that I have already done. And then a shadow again in the foreground. And the building towards the left, again, not doing too much here. You could decide, because there's a foreground, you could add more to it, more line work or detail. I'm just gonna indicate the primary pieces of it. Might want to, at this point, now that we've got quite a bit of graphite and shade happening here, protect that page. If you've come in the same order that I'm drawing, you might want to put a piece of paper under your hand to make sure that you're not making too much of a mess of your page. It's really the early stages of those construction lines that set you up for success or not, and checking that before you get to this level. Right now, I'm really just filling in what I've already determined. And so it's worth noting that those construction lines that I've drawn before, you can see that I'm not following them. That's because I drew them as just a guide to figure out the geometries of the lines that I will be coming back with. And there's a good example of seeing how Prismacolor line doesn't really erase the same way that graphite does. But I'm coming back now with more intentional line work to indicate a rational thinking behind where those lines are relative to not only the verticals, but the slab edge condition. So it's not just a similar panel that goes all the way up. They alternate. The vision glass is wider and the slab edge glass is smaller. So I'm seeing this horizontal banding. Again, 3-point perspective. That's what you're seeing. And I can even, just similarly to what I did in this case, because of this frit pattern that this building has, it's actually the slab edges that look lighter than the actual vision glass. Depending on how that's treated, a frit or a shadow box, it really varies whether they look the same. Some buildings that are done really, really well, like you can't really even see the difference between what's vision and what's opaque. But now you can see this is really a curtain wall building. I'll pull this down just to give a little definition to the foreground, that noise. And then we just go on our way down the line of buildings here to just show that this is a street wall that continues down on the right-hand side of the page. So again, just adding a little bit of tone to get these other, even these context buildings, although they don't have much to them, just enough to show that those are creating, these are forms worth noting. They're not flat objects in space. They actually do have something that adds to the context of this. So we look up, and I can also mention, I always want to erase those, any of those remaining lines that helped me at the beginning. Hopefully you drew them light enough that they don't become so difficult to erase in the end. Well, it's getting a little, I wouldn't say sloppy, but you spend less time creating things that you don't want people to focus on. You could spend, an hour on the building and then another hour on all the context. Well, that's not really what the point of the tutorial is about, so I'm not going to spend time on doing that, but of course you could if you wanted to. I'm not stopping you from exploring more and continuing beyond the things that I talk about. I haven't talked much about rendering skies in the class. It's some people I've seen will take an image and then they draw, if this is they just sky. Don't do that. Please, just like I've said in the past, don't draw a tree like a swirl. Like, it's better to not draw anything at all than draw a sky like that. The only thing, just like when these, I actually tend to draw tones of sky. I would rather ask you to draw with pencil rather than any other media, only because you can move it very, very easily. It can be blended very easily, and it can be erased very easily. So if I look at this image, I can see I'm getting off topic here, but I think that I'm at a point now where I'm comfortable with the way things are. You can even come back and add graphite to some of the places to kind of, if you're looking at adding another level of detail or contrast, just keep in mind that when you photograph or document this, um, the lines that you create, the shades that you create with the colored pencil are very matte. Graphite tends to come across as almost has a gloss to it. So in certain light, if I hold this, and even if I just look at it flat, you can kind of see that it has a kind of metallic reflectivity to it. All right, so if I wanted to render out these clouds, that means that the blue would be represented in the darker tones. So I just looking at the way that these clouds are formed, I just kind of go around the edges very, very lightly using the very edge of my pencil. And then they become more and more flat as you get further towards the horizon line. And the good thing here is, let's say I pushed a little bit too hard. Maybe I was a little too intentional and excited with my lines as they come down to create that vanishing point. And I erased and I erased. I tried to get rid of them, but they just don't erase as well as I wanted. This is a kind of nice way of hiding that. You can come back here, add a sky, very, very subtle. Don't do, again, this kind of sky where it's just scribble. You got to actually spend some time, move that graphite around. There are blending pencils that you can use that are paper and you can actually unwrap them that kind of clean themselves in the way that you unwrap them. If you do use your finger, there are natural oils. Those oils will eventually get kind of hidden behind all the graphite that you're moving. So your finger will end up looking like a miner, like you're working in coal, and then you have to actually get that off of your finger before you can come back and move it around again, because eventually you're just really moving nothing. You're kind of moving graphite on top of graphite. And it's better to go with a subtle level of tone here with graphite and then come back and add additional level of graphite to kind of create layers and layers on top of one another. You can also come back and add tone to this to show that there's a shadow or something on the underside of a cloud. That I'm not really encouraging people to spend much time doing clouds. Sometimes they're beneficial in order to set things off of the foreground. And they can also be good for, like I mentioned earlier, getting some of that construction line work that you can't quite get rid of with an eraser. But you might have to change fingers in order to do this. And I'm probably getting into way too much detail here for people within this class, but I noticed that some of my lines there were showing through in a way I didn't want, so I can come back and just start adding clouds this way. So I think that, all in all, this is coming together well enough. I might just want one last thing. This building, again, very, very, very reflective, all glass curtain wall. It's really just those facets. And I just want to set off this one thing. It's kind of an experiment. You know how it's really reflecting its context, its surroundings. What would it be? How would that look if just the top of some of these facets are showing off the sky a little bit, just enough to, yeah. I don't know. I'm always experimenting. I'm certainly not, I have been doing this for a long time, but as I go, the longer I do it, it's never as if I've done it so many times that I figured out and I'm finished. It's like the one style I always do. I know other people who are very, very good at perspective drawing, and they're wonderful. I love it. I love what they do, but sometimes they all look alike. They all look like the same drawing. There's nothing learned except there's no style that's really being enhanced. It's just the same style again and again. So I'm trying always to kind of break out of the comfort zone, even though it's difficult. I try different media. I hope that you're doing the same. Learning from mistakes and things that are working, and then you come back to those things and you can further develop them more and more. So this is one of those things that I tend to always come back to. The yellow gives me a little bit of a variation, a warmth, a reflectivity. It's a very, wow. I always I always draw these things on my paper. I'm just, of course, looking down, and then I look at the screen and how it's recording, and I see how the colors are shining through. Oh, it looks like a circus tent when I look at the way that it looks on screen. Oh, okay. Don't do what I just did. If you're looking at getting color to this, please don't. It looks bad on the screen. It does look better in person, but anyway, I've said too much. All right, so I look forward. I'm going to post this now. I look forward to seeing what you all do on this, the Spiritus Institute on Michigan Avenue. And we only have a few more classes to go, and we're near the end of the semester. Surprisingly, went very fast. Okay, thanks everyone, and good luck this week, and we will talk again soon.